in the ministry and the gospel. Let me tell you about my week this week. There's a reason I'm going to tell you this, but I started last weekend doing the weekend messages at Saddleback, Saddleback is a small struggling church in California. Some of you may be familiar with it. Pastor wrote a book, didn't sell a lot. Matter of fact, the pastor's book and my book together have sold 60 million copies, just so you know. You combine those two things together. So I did the weekend messages at Saddleback. We're doing this series on Grace in the Age of Rage, a 4-week series Pastor Rick Warren and I are doing together there. And so that was super. It's like, wow, coming off a high. I fly to Colorado Springs, where you get another kind of high, but I didn't. So I fly to Colorado Springs. And I go to Colorado Springs, and I'm like, you wake up and you smell the evangelicalism in the morning. And I was there, and I did some interviews. I mean, just had spent time with Compassion, and spent time with a pastor friend of mine, just riding on a high. And so then I fly to Portland, and I speak to a group of 1,000 charismatic Pentecostal pastors, right? So I got to tell you, right? How many of you are charismatic Pentecostal? Raise both hands. Both hands. There you go. All right. So as you've already seen, being with 1,000 Pentecostal pastors is like being with 5,000 Presbyterian pastors, just on the energy level, right? So it's going great, and I'm encouraging them. They're being encouraged, and I get on a plane. I got 2 flights to get home to Chicago. I get in, and I just riding high, and I get my first flight from Portland to Denver, and I'm going to get a little tired. I get my second flight from Denver to Chicago. It's still 8. I get in my house at 2 a.m. I wake up the next morning because my children have no respect for the fact that I got in at 2 a.m. So they're up ready to go to school, and then I get about 4 hours of sleep, and then I sit there a little bit later in the morning and say to my wife, "Baby, I'm just so down right now." And she looked at me and said, "But you just had this amazing few days, and now I'm listening to DC Talks. What if I stumble? What if I fall? What if I lose my step and I make fools of us all?" You have to be a certain generation to actually appreciate that. Thank you. Right, so, and again, it was wonderful all the way. The charismatic is just so encouraging. I'm not a charismatic. I work at a nonprofit organization, but it was so super encouraging to see. And so I left all this, but here's the reality, right? Sometimes we go from a high of ministry to a low that follows. And that's what happens to somebody in the Bible by the name of Elijah. Now, Elijah is here, and we're going to look at 3 lessons we learn from Elijah regarding depression and even suicidal thoughts. We're going to look specifically at 5 lessons we learned from God regarding ministering to those who struggling with depression and suicide. We're going to look at these things together. I'm going to share with you some research. And some of that research is research we did in partnership with the American Association of Christian Counselors. You have been a partner in this very research, 2 research projects. If you just Google these, you can find all of these, and I believe they'll be of great help to you. That's why the AACC partnered with us to do these things, right? So we've done these different studies that help us take a look at the reality. Here's what we found, right? We found that a lot of people have been impacted and are aware of the impact of suicide. 42% have had a family member, and 37% have had a friend take their own life. This is personal for me. Probably the first person I saw struggle with mental illness would be the first person that I would see end her life by suicide. And in doing so, I saw this brilliant young woman. She was both a doctor and a lawyer, and she was my aunt, and she died by suicide. And I didn't know why. Our family didn't talk about it. We didn't want to discuss it. But the reality is, people get that this is a topic and a discussion we need to be having. 76% agree suicide is a problem that needs to be proactively addressed in their community, agreeing somewhat or strongly. So the question is, who can address this? And I think the answer is that we respond as Isaiah responded in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 8, when he said, "Here I am, Lord, send me." Can you say those words out loud with me? Let's try it together. Here I am, Lord, send me. See, that's the call of every Christian, but in the midst of this reality, this crisis, if you will, how might we respond? Well, again, let's take a look at some lessons that we can learn and see from the life of Elijah. And we'll kind of zero in on just a few of those. Now, you remember Elijah. Elijah's all over the Bible. He shows up in the New Testament when Jesus appears with Moses and Elijah. So here's a great towering person and a great person of God in the Scriptures. And we're going to look in just a moment in 1 Kings chapter 19. But before we do, let me tell you what Elijah's doing before this moment of depression, and yes, even suicidal ideation. He's just come off the Battle of Mount Carmel, right? So this is this battle where the prophets of Baal were supposed to bring down fire from their gods, and then you had prophet Elijah was going to bring down fire from his God, the true God. And so he goes to this battle, and you know, they're just going all day, the prophets of Baal, we gotta make something happen, and Elijah's just kind of sitting back there, just kind of like leaning back, saying, you guys. And then it's Elijah's turn, and Elijah basically turns the scene into that scene from the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Fire comes down, everybody's consumed, right? See, so it just comes off of this, but there's all kinds of stuff going on. The nation sees and now is turning to God. He's been a prophet, and it's been not an easy time. We don't have time to go through all that was going on in Elijah's time, but it's not an easy time. And so after this great victory, though, what happens is that, well, there's someone who, because of this great victory, wants Elijah killed. I don't have time to unpack it all. But here he is, and now he's starting to run. As a matter of fact, it says in 1 Kings chapter 18, we begin this story, and Elijah is on the run. It says, and the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he gathered up his garment, and he ran. He begins to run for his life. And he flees, and in the process of changing from this great victory, now he is done, he is hiding, he is under a tree, he's empty emotionally. Don't you feel that way sometimes? When you've ministered and pour out all that you have. I think that's one of the reasons that in Romans, when Paul writes about spiritual gifts, he says those who show mercy do it with cheerfulness, because it's easy to get drawn down into that reality. So here he is, Elijah, sitting under a tree. Now don't miss this, right? All of these, Elijah's been a man of God for many years. Why does that matter? Here's why that matters, because even the most godly and wisely used of God face bouts with depression and sometimes even thoughts of suicide. And that's what Elijah was experiencing. And we see that in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 4 and 5. It says this, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came out and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, it's enough now, O Lord, take my life, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. So here he is, he's in the midst of this despair, and I want you not to miss this, because part of what I want to bring before you today is that we are not immune to the challenges, the stresses, even the mental illness that sometimes is among the population that we serve. And here we find the most godly and wisely used man of God, prophet of God, facing bouts of depression and thoughts of suicide. And I say this because one thing I think is sermons break stigmas, and I'm stunned by how many times when I talk about depression, for example, in the life of the church, and I talk about godly women and men in church history who struggled with depression, people will come up to me and say, I didn't think godly people struggled like I do. And the hurt is evident in their voices. There's actually been research done. And the research tells us a few things, particularly about maybe religion and suicide. According to a systematic review, this is a research review subsequently published in the Archives of Suicide Research. According to this review, religious affiliation and religious service attendance actually do not necessarily protect against suicidal ideation. The numbers are not statistically significant in their difference. But religious affiliation and religious service attendance actually do protect to some degree against suicide attempts. Now, why would that matter to us? Why would we want to know that data? Here's what we need to know. Okay, two things. First, it appears that the practice of religion does not free you from the challenges of suicidal ideation. Secondly, the practice of it might put you in a community and give you additional help to say no to it. Now, that matters for us because the work that we do is essential while suicide rates are on the rise. Now, I am not a counselor. I'm a missiologist by training. That's where my PhD is. I care about people engaging culture. Missiologists train people to cross cultures, right? So I teach people to engage the Pokot in Africa, the Quechua in the highlands of Peru, and the Iban in Malaysia. I don't generally train counselors, but if you're going to talk about engaging the culture in 2019 in the Western world, you have got to talk about suicide. It's a missional issue today. Perhaps it always was, but with U.S. suicide rate now 33% higher in 2017 than in 1999, it catches our attention. And we see 14 suicides per 100,000. We all know, just this year in my own community, in the school district where my children attend, we all know of several people who have indeed died by suicide. And again, these are the highest suicide rates since World War II. Now again, I'm the father of 3 daughters. I have a 15-year-old, a 17-year-old, and a 21-year-old daughter. This is both a statement of my situation and a moment for intercessory prayer. It's the greatest thing in the world, though they have so many words. But anyway, that's another story for another day. So I have children who are youth or young adults, and what we find here is the suicide rates have been rapidly increasing for youth and young adults. We see things like 13 Reasons Why, and that was so pervasive in the conversation. I sat down to talk with my children. We got notices from the school. This is a broken reality of our culture today. Suicide rates are rising more rapidly among boys and girls ages 10 to 14 than in any other age group. Listen, I want you to miss this, because I know sometimes for those who may not have young children, I don't have young children, I don't have teenage children, what it's like to be 13 in 2019 is very different than it was like to be 13 when I was 13. And we see that with HBO series like Euphoria, which displays the 13-year-old life of drugs and sex and suicide and more as evident and prevalent, and it is caught on with so many because it's a reflection of so many's reality. So the suicide rates are evident and of concern before us. Sometimes maybe it helps to see something in a chart and to look at the age-adjusted suicide rate from 1907 to 2017. This is published in Time magazine from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It's actually a multiple sources of data, not just one, but I want you to not miss what's going on here. A couple of things worth noting, right? You can look and see how during the Great Depression, suicide rates drastically increased, and we do see times of economic difficulty are indeed connected sometimes to a rising suicide rate. But you know, our economy has been actually getting better since 2007, while our suicide rate has actually been increasing during that time. Now again, so these are the realities we face as the church, and we've got to recognize our call is to go into this moment. We say, "Here I am, Lord, send me." We recognize and we believe that God heals. I do, probably you do as well, but not always in all the ways that we want in the time that we want it. God heals, but sometimes it's not evident and present before us right then. We serve a God who's willing and able to heal us from spiritual, physical, and indeed mental infirmities. But we would not need to be here if that healing was instantaneous without help and sometimes without assistance even from medical community. See, that healing is not guaranteed this side of eternity. Matter of fact, Jesus promises us, and this is not a promise that you take on your wall or put on a plaque, but he promises us, in this world, you will have trouble. Now, I know that could be the most helpful plaque ever, but nobody wants to put it on their front door. Nobody wants it on their refrigerator, right? Pain isn't just probable, it's expected. That's why we need a church to step in to the midst of it. Let's take a look at what happens here with Elijah again. See, those moments and seasons of depression and suicidal thoughts can be initiated by a catalytic moment or event. We know that from evidence-based research. But it's also present here, right? So we actually see this in 1 Kings 19, verses 1 and 2. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Not actually what happened, but then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." I mean, she's saying, I'm going to kill you as you killed others by the river. Now, why does that matter? Because here's the reality. We have all been at that moment of brokenness, that moment when we're not sure. Maybe that moment when too many things have come together. I'm just talking about the simplicity of what pastors sometimes call the Monday morning hangover. I don't know if you've heard of the Monday morning hangover. I'm a Baptist, so I don't drink in front of other people, and so, or at all. And I met some Lutherans earlier here, because I know whenever there's 4 Lutherans, there's always a 5th. The Pentecostals are like, I don't get that. Why is that funny to so many people? Those people laughing are sinners. But you know, I mean, I shared earlier, so I came out of this really remarkable season of ministry. I mean, I was just excited, and then the next day I was deflated. But that's nothing compared to the times when we've heard news in our lives. I remember the time my daughter was in the hospital for 7 days in this very city, Nashville Children's Hospital, and they were bringing in heart equipment because her heart was slowing, and they were afraid. For 7 days, the Center for Disease Control was on the phone, where they were ready for any moment if her heart stopped, and I'm sitting here despairing of life. We've had those rallies. Sometimes those rallies are not one-time thing. Just a few minutes ago, I actually had the privilege of having Jennifer Ellis and Tim Clinton on my national radio show on Moody Radio. And we talked a little bit about this, and the calls started to come in. I got to tell you, the calls are heartbreaking. And they started to come in and say, I can't find anyone to help. And I guess, you know, they're counselors by training, and they're ready to jump into this. But there's so often this something that has happened or is happening, or some trauma of the past, or some challenge of the present. And the recurring theme, even on our phone calls, was people ended up distanced from others. So if we're going to respond as Isaiah did, here I am, Lord, send me. It's essential for us, even in the midst of this. We did a survey and we asked people who had actually known somebody who had died by suicide, what happened? This is of loved ones, of someone has a loved one who had died by suicide. And 49% agree somewhat or strongly they had withdrawn from most of their relationships. See, this is where we come and we hear the words, here I am, Lord, send me. And so the call that we have, and I was thinking this as I was hearing this woman talk on the phone 30 minutes ago, and Tim Clinton speaking lovingly into her heart, but he said, do you have a community of somebody connected with? She said, no, I'm disconnected, I'm by myself. And in the midst of that is our call. Sometimes it's a local church ministry of care, a Stephen ministry, an encouragement ministry, a lay counseling or lay exhortation ministry. But the pursuing of relationships is essential in moments like this. See, those moments or seasons of depression or suicidal thoughts sometimes intensify when we're depleted, exhausted, and discouraged. We actually see that throughout 1 Kings chapter 18. It's the story of 1 Kings chapter 18, right? So he's full of this. He says, it's enough now, O Lord, take away my life. And then he lay down and slept under a broom tree. I got nothing left. Now here's the thing. I know, I want you to hear this. I know that you know more than me about how to deal with depression, suicidal ideation, and mental health issues. But I also know that, like me, you need to be encouraged yourself in the midst of caring for others to care for yourself. I also know that we need to be reminded of some of these realities. That struggle is often unknown by other people. Don't miss this next slide. We actually asked the question among Protestant churchgoers who have had a family member or close acquaintance die by suicide. We asked the question, during the months prior to death, who was aware of the person's struggles or risk of suicide? Those numbers are actually shockingly low. We don't always know. And in the midst of not knowing, nobody that I was aware of is the most common answer. In the midst of not knowing, how do we know better? I mean, don't miss this. Elijah was alone by himself. Sent his servant away. He's alone by himself in the midst of his discouragement and pain. Now, it's interesting. Even here, we learn some lessons from God. We learn some things from Elijah, but we learn some lessons from God. Now again, this is not a diagnosis, and this is not a prescriptive plan. The Bible doesn't intend for us to take this one particular situation and say this is applicable and appropriate for every person with whom we deal. But it is perfectly true, as the Word of God is, and we can apply other evidence-based practices alongside of it. But let's take a look at what happens here. First, we see God actually directing here, and in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 5 to 8, look at what happens. And he lay down and slept under a broom tree, and behold, an angel touched him and said to him, arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was a There was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate, and he drank, and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord, by the way, comes to a second time, right? Comes to a second time. Comes to him again and said, arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. Arose, and he ate and drank. Because there were seconds. That's not in the Bible, but it's there. Now, I will tell you, I debated this passage because of this point. I am not a bastion of physical strength. I am not the best example of taking care of your physical health. But I come before you in the midst of my weakness and say this is an area where I'm trying to grow. Because I recognize that my emotional health, my psychological health, all of these things are connected just like they are to you, to me. So if you're a person who struggles as I do, don't let that struggle go to despair. But instead ask, what steps can I take? If you don't struggle as I do, ask that question anyway. It's not the only place that we see. We also see a call to focus on your spiritual health. We see that this is an exhortation for you and for me in verses 8 and 9. Second part of verse 8, it says that he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. There he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? So in other words, Elijah gets away with God because he needs to get away with God to focus on his spiritual health. Can I just get a little personal to me and to you for just a moment? Part of the reason that we ourselves, in pouring out all the time, find ourselves often empty is because we're not refilling our spiritual lives ourselves. The old expression, physicians, heal thyself, is often related to me. As I'm sitting there on Wednesday, coming back from Portland Wednesday morning, I said, I just need a little rest and a little time with the Lord. And so I imagine might you. Which also leads us maybe to the next thing, to focus on your emotional health. Where are we? What are our relationships that we have that are speaking into our life? It says this, there he came to that cave and he lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? He said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I only am left. And they seek my life to take it away. So he actually is going here to this place to get away and to get closer, to respond to hear from the Lord. And he recognized I need to part speak of the situation that I'm in. It's okay to say, sisters and brothers, that I'm exhausted. That I'm done. I was reading in preparation for a summit, I'll tell you about just a little bit about pastors and ministers, mental health and suicide that we just announced yesterday. But I was reading something by Ruth Haley Barton, and at the end of one of her books, in an exercise she'll do at this summit, she actually goes through these signs that you're too close to burnout, that you're unhealthy in your balance. And I started going through them, and I was like, oops, oops, oops. So I recognize even this past week in my own area. Can I just stand before you and say, in my own area, I got to work on some stuff as well. But can we maybe learn on that together? By the way, pastors always preach a message that they have not yet fully lived, or else we would be walking day to day in perfection. But I stand before you saying, I'm struggling. I grow in these areas as well. And what did Elijah do? He also focused on missional health. A good reminder to us. Focused on missional. He actually had a call and a cause to do. And sometimes getting back to that call and the cause in verses 11 through 17 speak about that. And he said, go out and stand before the mount of the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by. And you're going to begin to recognize this passage. And the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountain and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. He had to connect again with God. It says in verse 13, and when he had heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And there, behold, came a voice saying to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he repeats again. And then he hears the word of the Lord to go and return your way to the wilderness of Damascus and to get back on that mission. Now, mind you, this is where we don't want to make a prescription. This was God's call for Elijah in God's timing. But part of what Elijah needed to do was to focus on his spiritual health, focus on his physical health, focus on his encounter, his emotional health, his encounter with himself and God. And then he again focused on his missional task. And finally, focus on your relational health. Sisters and brothers, one of the things I've learned in the last 2 weeks talking about suicide, pastors, and mental health. After the death by suicide of Jared Wilson, many of you saw, you knew Jared. Jared was an advocate with us against suicide. And he died by suicide not that long ago. And in the midst of this, we're reminded that so often, I'm not speaking about Jared's situation in this case, but so often there's an aloneness that's there. Listen to where in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 18, it says, "Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." There are people that come alongside us like they came alongside Elijah. Verse 19, "So he departed from there and found," and he begins to talk about people that he went alongside with. This is not a journey we can do alone. This is why I make the trek here to the American Association of Christian Counselors, because I believe that pastors and churches and mental health professionals like you must partner together. Now, here's the reality. I don't want you to miss this. It's not always so easy. So let me quickly just share a few things in conclusion, right? How we ask the question, how can we represent Jesus to the Elijahs in our midst? Maybe that's us. How can we do those things? Because as I showed you last time I was here, the last World Conference, we actually find a big gap. A lot of pastors think there's mental health resources. Look at that top line. Churchgoers aren't aware of them. There's a disparity between pastors. We've got a small group that'll encourage people. We got a list of mental health professionals on campus. We regularly speak about mental health issues to remove stigma. And then the people in the church say, no, we don't have any of those things. And that's not happening here. There's a gap. Part of that gap is what we do together in this journey. Because here's the reality. People recognize that churches should provide help. 84% agree that churches have a responsibility to provide resources and support to individuals with mental illness and their families. So what is our call? Well, for all of us, it's a reminder. Church is always meant to be a place for broken people to come, gather, and experience the love and freedom found in Christ. Brothers and sisters, tell your pastors, if your church doesn't have broken people, it's a broken church. Churches need to be willing to acknowledge, destigmatize mental illness around us. Seek out those who are hurting. Here I am, Lord, send me. And yes, be persistent in times of pain. Continue to pursue relationships even when it's hard. So one of the things that we did after Jared Wilson's death by suicide is I called my friend Derwin Gray, who's close to the Wilsons, to reach out to his widow and Julie, and said, would this be something that would encourage her family? And she said, yes, it would be an honor to do something to respond to Jared's death by suicide. I called Rick Warren and said, would you come do this with us? And so we're gathering. This is just a few of the people that are going to be here. For example, you'll see President Phil Reichen, the president of my institution, who has shared in depth his struggle with depression and at times his suicidal ideation. It's a safe place to do so there. And we've gathered together to say on December 6th that Wheaton College at the Billy Graham Center, and we'll stream this around the world, we're going to have a conversation about leadership, burnout, mental health among the leaders, among the pastors, among the ministers, among the counselors. So again, we're talking about here mental health, suicide, and the church, right? I think it's a Jared Wilson moment. Most of you know the name because you walked through the situation. It ended up in USA Today, it ended up in LA Times, and more. And the fact is, looking here, we know even spiritual giants will struggle. We have to stop thinking that the more godly you are, the fact is you will struggle less. Sometimes that's not the case at all. Some of the great spiritual heroes of our day struggled intensely, and we do as well. And again, let me remind you, Sermons Break Stigmas, partner with your pastor so that pastor can share as well. But you know, the world is not enough. That's not the name of a film. That's a reality that people are finding. Well, no, one of the reasons why we see so much despair around us, because we live in a world where you can say anything, claim to be anything, walk on any path and journey that you want. And what people are finding is it's just not enough. We bring the hope of the gospel and the health of healing that comes from Christ. I want to encourage you, if you'd like to come, you can get information at gc2-summit.com. But in either way, even as we're gathered here today, may God use you, but may God also give you the wisdom to respond to your own emotional, spiritual, and physical health as well. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we do come before you today, and we ask that by your grace and your goodness, you would remind us again and again that we are called by Jesus, and we are sent on mission, and the world's hurting. And the healers are in this room and in our churches, other places as well. But Lord, I pray that we might respond as Isaiah did. Here I am, Lord, send me. Just with your head bowed and your eyes closed for just a moment, I wonder if you might think of the brokenness of the world, the brokenness in and outside of the church, the struggle that's there, and if you might again commit yourself to Christ with the words of Isaiah. If that's where you are, maybe we're just going to verbally say this prayer. If it's the prayer of your heart, just here I am, Lord, send me. We'll verbally say it together. But into a midst of a world that's not enough, that's looking for something more, that needs to hear the good news of Jesus and the health, hope, and healing that comes from his people like you who counsel alongside them. If it's the prayer of your heart, let's say it together. Here I am, Lord, send me. One more time. Here I am, Lord, send me. In Jesus' name, and for his sake we pray.